This story happened to my Aunt Melody in March of 2012. She lives in a log cabin, not too far from where I lived with my parents on the other side of the I-65 highway. For a little background, my aunt has a bad back and always had to contract out any work done to the home. For meager work like cleaning windows and bathrooms, she would have me or my mother come over to do the work, and she would pay us generously. For more complex things like remodeling her kitchen, she would hire crews to do the work. It was quite common for a team of guys to be over during the spring or the summer, repairing something or remodeling her outside porch. Being a log cabin of some age, it required a lot of upkeep. So, in the middle of March 2012, she was having a guy who she's known for years use his crew to remodel her kitchen floor and cabinets. This guy, who we'll call Jimmy, runs a private contracting service that specializes in carpentry-related services, laying carpet, hardwood floor, and tiling bathrooms, etc. So this job was typical for them. Jimmy came over with his crew of laborers, and they began taking measurements of the kitchen and marking off where the doors were, and taking pictures of a couple of areas. While all of this was going on, one of the crew in particular was kind of chatty with my aunt. This guy's name was William, but most of the guys seemed to call him Bill. My aunt chatted with the guy as he took measurements and drew on sketch paper, making notes with numbers that he would underline. My aunt got creeped out by the guy. She got weirded out by his questions after only a few minutes. Bill asks her about her husband and what he does. She tells him that he's a truck driver, and she says at that moment, she saw the faintest glimmer of elation in the man's face, as if the answer was exactly what he wanted. He asked about her kids and how old they were, and then it got creepier. The man inferred how lonely she must be, living at home, all alone all of the time. This really got under her skin. Now, as she finds a way to get away from Bill, my aunt takes a fake phone call and leaves to her bedroom while the men work. Fast forward about 90 minutes. Jimmy and his crew are preparing to leave. Jimmy tells my aunt that Bill will be staying behind for a few minutes to finish up some measurements and will have her pick out what style of countertop she wants. This made her uneasy. She's already been creeped out by him earlier, and now she's going to have to talk to him for God knows how long. He took forever to do his work since he was always getting sidetracked and talking to my aunt. My aunt was sitting in the kitchen. Bill came into the kitchen as well, with his tool belt on, and on it was a hammer. Now, this entire time, they hadn't needed to do any actual work, so why, all of a sudden, has this guy walked in with his tools? Bill started to ask my Aunt Melody a bunch of personal questions. She quickly tried to make her selections for the materials they were going to use. Afterwards, she said, "Okay, well, we're all done here, right?" Bill nodded and thanked her and started to box up the samples, all the while chatting to her about really personal things. Then, when he was done, he turned around, and this is when my aunt got really creeped out. He simply looked at her and said, "Well, I guess you're going to be all alone here for a while, aren't you?" My aunt didn't know how to reply. She just kind of laughed a nervous laugh and said, "Oh, well, I'm kind of used to it." Bill just stared at her, no longer smiling. He just stood there, as if he was deciding on something. My aunt started feeling very threatened. She started to wonder what Bill was going to do with the hammer that he clearly didn't need. "He's just weird," she told herself. "You're just being paranoid." That's when Tiny, my aunt's little chihuahua, announces his presence by barking loudly. Tiny's just woken up, and he's managed to open my aunt's bedroom door and run down the short hallway to where my aunt and Bill stood. Tiny hates everybody, except my aunt, my uncle, and my cousin, Justin. So, Tiny starts his never-ending bark and growl. Bill looks down at the dog, and that's when my aunt sees it. his face crazy with hatred as he stared back at the dog, not saying a word. My aunt says that's when it seemed like he was going to reach for the hammer. That's when, not a moment too soon, my cousin Justin chimes in from above. "Hey, what's going on down there? Who's Tiny befriending now?" My aunt, instantly relieved, remembered that her son had come in late the previous evening after a night of heavy drinking. He had crashed on a couch upstairs and had been sleeping the day away until Tiny started throwing a fit. He saw his mother and the look of dread on her face, and instantly saw that she was uneasy with the guy standing just a few feet in front of her. He walked calmly down the stairs. Now, Justin is 6'5", 210 pounds, and lean. He's never had a problem with people wanting to pick a fight with him. So there they are, my aunt, my cousin now standing next to her, and Bill, standing there, now bewildered, clearly not realizing they weren't alone. Bill's a dumpy-looking guy, with a moustache of a villain from one of those old westerns. He's probably in his early 50s or late 40s at this point, not a threat to my cousin. He collects himself and says, "Okay, well, I'll be going now. It was nice meeting you." He turned and picked up his tools and materials and left out the front door. Fast forward to 3 days later. My aunt receives a phone call from Bill. He says they had some errors and a few things weren't added up right for the ordering process, and he needed to come back and recheck some measurements. Now, my aunt is home and she's by herself. She's still creeped out by this guy, so she replies, "No, actually I'm not home right now. Could you guys come back a little later, or perhaps tomorrow?" "Oh, it's just me, ma'am. I'm in the area and Jimmy told me about it, and I told him I could swing by and get the figures. When do you think you'll be home? I can wait for you." My aunt pauses. No, don't do that. I'm not sure how long I'll be, and I wouldn't want you to wait." "Okay, ma'am. Just call this number when you're home, and I'll come over." Sure thing. Bye." My aunt hung up the phone, and then took Tiny outside to go to the bathroom. She looked up the hill outside, and she saw it. The van, parked up the street, facing her driveway. She looked at it, and she knew it was the same one that Bill drove away in the previous week. Things started to piece together in her head. The creepy demeanor, the awkward questions, the tension when they both thought they were alone, the feeling that he was debating whether or not to hurt her. She realized that she was in danger. She called Jimmy immediately, and he picked her up. It turns out that Jimmy had never sent Bill to get more measurements. They had already placed the orders, and they didn't need to come back for anything until it was time to install. Fast forward to April, and my aunt is watching the news. A news story comes on about the arrest of a suspected serial killer in New Albany, Indiana, which is 30 minutes north of where we live. My aunt turns up the volume to hear the details. They flashed a picture of Bill, better known as William Clyde Gibson. The man who had creeped her out and tried to get her alone turned out to be a serial killer. William Clyde Gibson was convicted of murdering Karen Hadella, Stephanie Kirk, and Christine Wittis. My aunt called my uncle sobbing and told him what she saw, and she called my mother, and my mother told me. When we all look back at what happened to my aunt, she's very lucky not to have turned out to be victim number 4. Needless to say, people should always listen to their gut. Most of the time, when people seem a little off, they probably are. Please note that a link to Bill's Murderpedia file and a news story about the case can be found in the description below.